Before the freeze of 1881 claimed its first human victim, every soul in the Arkansas River Valley had already agreed that Yuri Volkov was actively building his own tomb. In the eyes of the valley, a man playing with mud in October was a man who had lost his mind. But Yuri's hands didn't know the language of timber. They knew the quiet, heavy language of Poltava clay. Back in Ukraine, he was not just a laborer. He was a pechnik, a master of the ancient clay stoves that had kept families alive through centuries of brutal winters. He understood that heat was not a wild animal to be fought, but a fluid energy to be caught, cradled, and stored. When Yuri, his wife Nadia, and their children, Petro and Oksana, arrived in Colorado, they sought a sanctuary, a piece of land they could cultivate with their own sweat. They had purchased a standard cabin with tight saddle notches, built by the valley's best builder, Silas Vance. It looked like a proper American home, but Yuri knew it was a box of cold. He spent his first weeks digging a great pit in the heavy yellow clay near the creek. While others stacked split pine, Yuri hauled mud in a squeaking barrow. He mixed it with water and dry grass, working with a rhythmic patience that looked like madness to the onlookers. He kneaded the clay with his bare feet, feeling its density, its strength. His father had taught him in Poltava that clay was a living thing, a material that remembered the warmth of the sun and could hold it for those who treated it with respect. The smell of the earth, damp and rich, reminded him of the vast steppes, a comforting connection in this rugged, unfamiliar territory. Nadia worked beside him, her apron stained with the ochre mud, her quiet determination mirroring his own. They did not have the money to buy thousands of bricks, nor did they have the time to learn the complex carpentry of the Americans, but they had the earth, and they had the knowledge of their ancestors. The children, Petro and Oksana, ran through the dry bunchgrass, their laughter ringing out under the massive blue Colorado sky, seemingly oblivious to the cold wind that had begun to creep down from the high peaks. The Sawatch Range stood in the distance, a line of white teeth against the horizon, warning them that the seasons were shifting. But Yuri didn't rush. He chose each stone for the foundation of his internal stove, placing them with a deliberate, slow care. He knew that if the foundation was weak, the clay would crack under the immense thermal stress of the winter fires. To his neighbors, he was just a strange immigrant doing peasant work, wasting precious days before the frost. They didn't see the internal stove he was planning, a massive heart of clay that would sit against the logs, designed to hold the fire's breath long after the wood burned away. They only saw a man covered in dirt, hauling water from the freezing creek and packing mud against his own house. They shook their heads as they drove their wagons past the Volkov homestead, secure in their own preparations, confident that their log cabins and stacked wood piles would be more than enough to see them through. But Yuri kept working, his mind quiet, his hands steady in the mud. To understand why Yuri was willing to endure the ridicule of the entire valley, you had to understand the quiet, grinding misery of their first winter in that cabin. The structure, built of beautiful hand-hewn lodgepole pine, was a masterpiece of pioneer craftsmanship. The logs were straight, the notches were clean, and Silas Vance had packed the seams with moss and lime mortar. On a sunny September afternoon, it looked like a fortress of comfort, a solid wall between the family and the wild world outside. But when December arrived, the cabin revealed its true nature. It was not a barrier, it was a sieve. The cold did not assault them with a sudden blow. It crept in, silent and relentless, finding every microscopic gap in the chinking. It snaked along the pine floorboards in thin, icy currents that chilled their feet, even when the cast-iron stove was roaring red-hot. Nadia would wake in the dark before dawn to find a thick skin of ice on the water bucket, placed just 10 feet from the hearth. The rich beet soup she prepared, steaming and fragrant in its pot, would cool to a lukewarm slush minutes after she ladled it into their bowls. The worst of it was the drafts. They were not gusts of wind that you could hear or fight. They were a constant, invisible flow of freezing air that settled in the corners and pooled around their bedrolls. The stove demanded a relentless supply of wood, consuming split pine with a ravenous appetite. Yuri spent his days swinging the splitting maul, his shoulders aching, his hands split and bleeding from the raw cold. He watched his woodpile, which had seemed so immense in October, shrink to nothing by mid-January. Yet, despite the constant fires, the cabin's logs remained cold to the touch. They absorbed the stove's heat and conducted it straight to the frozen outdoors, leaving the interior air thin and dry. Every breath they took crystallized on the logs, forming a delicate, feathery coat of rime frost that climbed the walls. It was a beautiful, terrifying decoration, a sign that the house was not keeping the winter out, but letting it in. Oksana, their 5-year-old daughter, developed a dry, rattling cough that seemed to shake her fragile chest. Nadia would sit beside her through the dark hours, wrapping her in every wool blanket and heavy coat they owned, her own breath fogging in the dim light of the tallow candle. Yuri would stand by the stove, feeding it log after log, his mind filled with a sense of profound helplessness. He was burning through his fuel, destroying his body with labor, and still, his family was freezing. He realized then that the log cabin was a trap. It was a lightweight shell with no thermal mass, no momentum to hold the heat. It was like trying to keep a bucket full of water when the bottom is full of holes. The pine logs, though thick, could not store the energy of the fire. They merely insulated the cold from the warm, and the cold was winning. Yuri knew he could not change the timber, and he could not stop the Colorado wind from screaming down the valley, but he could change the way his home held energy. He could build a heat battery, a massive reservoir of earth that would anchor the warmth and protect his family. But to do that, he would have to do the unthinkable. He would have to bury his house in mud. Yuri spent the spring of 1881 studying the cabin, observing the way the wind scoured the north wall and how the sun warmed the south-facing logs during the brief winter afternoons. He was not a carpenter, but he knew the physics of heat better than any man in the territory. He knew that to fight the cold, he needed to stop the convective air currents that stripped warmth from the cabin's exterior, and he needed a massive internal anchor to store thermal energy. His plan was a radical combination of old-world wisdom and raw necessity. First, he would build a massive internal masonry heater, a traditional Ukrainian pek in the very center of the cabin. This stove would not be a simple iron box. It would be constructed of heavy river stones and thick layers of clay, containing a serpentine flue path that forced the hot exhaust gases to travel through multiple chambers before escaping the chimney. This would capture nearly 80% of the heat from combustion, storing it in the massive brick and stone structure, which would then slowly radiate warmth for 24 hours on a single firing. But the internal stove was only half the equation. To protect the cabin from the relentless wind, Yuri planned to build a massive earthen berm on the outside, enveloping the north, east, and west walls. This was not just a pile of dirt. It was a carefully formulated mixture of clay, coarse river sand, and dry bunch grass. He called it cob. The straw from the grass would act as a natural insulation layer, trapping microscopic pockets of still air, while the dense clay and sand would provide massive thermal mass. The berm would be sloped, creating a natural rampart that would deflect the wind up and over the cabin, preventing convective heat loss. The wind would slide over the rounded structure, rather than battering against the flat log walls. This would create a dead air buffer zone, stilling the air before it could reach the timber. The earth itself, once warmed by the heat escaping from the cabin, would act as a massive heat sink, holding a stable temperature and preventing the logs from freezing. Nadia listened to his explanation, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and anxiety. She remembered the warm peck of her childhood, the comfort of sleeping on the warm clay platform during the worst winters in Poltava, but she also knew what their neighbors would say. "They will call us peasants, Yuri," she whispered as they sat by the quiet stove. "They will say, we are living like animals in the ground." Yuri took her hand, his voice steady. "Let them say what they want, Nadia. I would rather be a warm peasant than a frozen gentleman." He began his preparations, clearing the center of the cabin floor, reinforcing the joists with heavy river stones to support the immense weight of the new stove. He hauled the clay, barrow by barrow, his mind focused on the goal. He knew the risks. If the clay mixture was too wet, it would crack and collapse. If there was too much straw, it would rot. If the drainage was poor, water would pool against the logs and destroy his foundation. He measured every ingredient with the care of an apothecary, trusting his instincts, his memories, and the simple laws of nature. By October, the internal stove was taking shape, its heavy, rounded form dominating the cabin's interior, looking like a quiet giant waiting to be awakened. Now, it was time to step outside and begin the work that would make him the laughingstock of the valley. He stood in his yard, looking at the straight, clean pine logs of his home, and picked up his shovel. He was ready to build his hill. The work began at dawn, under a sky that had already taken on the cold, pale look of late autumn. Yuri worked in his undershirt, his boots discarded, his bare feet sinking into the thick, cold mixture of clay and sand. He had dug a massive pit, 50 yards from the cabin, where the soil was a rich, heavy ochre, full of the fine silt that makes for perfect cob. He hauled the clay in a heavy wooden wheelbarrow, dumping it in a wide circle near the cabin's north wall. Then came the mixing. He added river sand to prevent the clay from shrinking and cracking as it dried, and handfuls of dry bunchgrass he had harvested from the prairie. He poured bucket after bucket of creek water over the pile, the water freezing at the edges of the pit as he worked. He danced in the mud, a slow, rhythmic stomp that packed the ingredients together, breaking up the clumps of clay, forcing the straw deep into the mixture. It was exhausting, bone-shattering labor. The cold mud numbed his feet and legs, and the wind from the Sawatch Range bit through his undershirt, but he didn't stop. Nadia worked beside him, her skirt tucked up, her hands covered in the yellow clay. Together, they carried the thick, plastic mud in wooden buckets, dumping it at the base of the cabin's logs. Yuri applied the cob in courses about a foot high, tamping it down with the back of his shovel and his bare hands, smoothing the surface into a gentle, sloping curve. He knew he couldn't build too fast. Each layer had to dry and set before it could support the weight of the next, or the entire wall would slump into a useless heap. Petro and Oksana helped where they could, carrying small handfuls of straw, their faces bright with the excitement of what looked like a giant game of mud play. But to Yuri, every handful of straw, every bucket of clay, was a barrier against the coming frost. He worked with a quiet, intense focus, his mind calculating the thickness, the slope, the density. The berm rose slowly, wrapping around the north wall first, the wall that took the brunt of the Arctic winds, before extending to the east and west. The work was a physical trial that stretched their endurance to the limit. Yuri's back was a constant dull ache, and Nadia's hands were raw and split from the alkali in the clay. Every evening, they would sit by their small stove, their bodies exhausted, their clothes stained with the yellow earth. But they could feel the difference already. The north wall, now backed by 2 feet of damp earth, felt less drafty. The cold seemed to hesitate before entering. He built the berm thick at the base, nearly 6 feet of packed earth, tapering to about 3 feet as it reached the roofline. He was careful to leave a small gap of 2 inches between the outer log wall and the clay packed with dry straw. This would allow any moisture escaping from the cabin's interior to wick away through the straw and the breathable clay, rather than trapping it against the wood, preventing the rot that Silas Vance had predicted. It was a detail he had learned from building ship hulls in Bergen. Wood must breathe, even when buried. By the end of the second week, the cabin had lost its sharp, clean lines. It no longer looked like a standard American home, proud and square on the prairie. It looked like an organic growth, a low, rounded mound of earth that seemed to be emerging from the soil rather than resting upon it. It was a strange, silent presence on the landscape, a monument to one man's stubborn belief in the laws of heat. Yuri stood back, wiping the sweat and clay from his forehead, and looked at his work. The mud was drying, turning a light, sandy gold in the autumn sun. It was solid. It was heavy. It was ready. Caleb Dorsey's equivalent, Silas Vance, stopped his team on the rutted track that ran past the Volkov homestead on a cold afternoon in late October. Vance was the valley's premier timber framer, a man whose reputation was as solid as the mortise and tenon joints he crafted. He was a master of his trade, and his opinions on building were respected by everyone from the river to the high passes. He sat in his wagon, his hands resting on the reins, and stared at the massive mud structure, with an expression of pure disbelief. He watched Yuri haul another barrow of the thick yellow mud, dumping it at the base of the east wall. Vance shook his head, then climbed down from the wagon, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen bunch grass. He walked up to the edge of the berm, his eyes scanning the logs, his brow furrowed in deep concern. He was not a cruel man. He genuinely cared about the families in the settlement, and what he saw looked like a disaster in the making. "Yuri," Vance called out, his voice carrying the calm, steady authority of an expert. "What in God's name are you doing to that cabin?" Yuri paused, leaning on his shovel, wiping a muddy sleeve across his face. He looked at the builder, his expression calm and patient. "I am making it warm, Mr. Vance," Yuri replied, his English still holding the thick, musical cadence of his homeland. "I am building a jacket of earth to protect my family from the wind." Jedediah Thorne, who had been riding with Vance, let out a loud, incredulous laugh from the wagon. "Making it warm by burying it under mud? It looks like you're trying to turn a perfectly good home into a badger den, Volkov. If the cold doesn't kill you, the damp will." Vance did not laugh. He stepped closer, touching the damp clay with a gloved finger. "Yuri, listen to me," Vance said, his tone serious and direct. "I've been framing houses in these mountains for 15 years. I know green pine, and I know how wood behaves. You are packing 40 tons of wet, heavy clay directly against green logs. They can't breathe, man. Come spring, when the thaw hits, that earth is going to saturate with water. Those logs will draw that moisture like a sponge. They'll sweat in the dark, and they'll be rotten punk by May. You're digging a grave for your own house. It's a mud coffin." Yuri listened to the warning, his respect for the carpenter's experience evident in his quiet demeanor. He knew Vance was a master of his craft, but he also knew that Vance's knowledge stopped at the edge of the forest. Vance understood wood, but he did not understand the behavior of earth and heat. Yuri walked over to the wall and pressed his palm flat against the damp clay. "In my country, Mr. Vance," Yuri said softly, "we say the clay is a mother. It pulls the wetness from the timber, it breathes, it keeps the logs dry. The straw inside is like a pipe, it lets the air move. The wood will not rot. It will stay dry, and it will stay warm." Vance just sighed, a mixture of frustration and pity on his face. "The clay doesn't breathe, Yuri. It holds water. And when the freeze hits, that mud will turn to solid ice, and it'll crack your logs like walnuts. I've given you my warning. I won't have a hand in rebuilding when this heap collapses." He turned and walked back to his wagon, climbing onto the bench beside Thorne. They drove away, their laughter drifting back on the cold wind. At the trading post that evening, the story of Volkov's grave became the main entertainment. Men joked about the Hungarian who was trying to grow potatoes on his walls, and women expressed pity for Nadia, married to a man who preferred mud to timber. But Yuri ignored the talk. He knew that the only critic that mattered was the winter, and the winter was already on its way. The days grew shorter, the light taking on a thin, watery quality as November arrived. The cottonwoods along the Arkansas River had shed their last leaves, their gray branches standing like skeletons against the pale sky. The wind from the Sawatch Range grew sharper, a daily reminder that their time was running out. Yuri and Nadia worked with a desperate intensity, their bodies pushed to the absolute limit of physical endurance. Every muscle in Yuri's back was a knot of pain, and his hands were permanently stained with the yellow clay, the skin raw and cracked from the alkaline soil. Nadia's arms were bruised and sore from hauling the heavy wooden buckets, and her feet were constantly numb from mixing the cold mud. The children no longer played. They sat inside the cabin, their quiet faces watching their parents through the small windows, their world shrinking as the darkness grew. The physical transformation of the cabin was complete. It was no longer a standard American log home, proud and square on the Colorado prairie. It had become a low, rounded, organic shape, a smooth mound of sandy gold that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. It looked like a barrow, an ancient burial mound, or a natural formation carved by centuries of wind and water. The sharp corners were gone, replaced by soft, flowing curves that sloped down to the ground. From a distance, it was hard to tell where the prairie ended and the house began. Nadia would stand in the yard in the evening, her body shivering, and look at the strange structure with a sense of silent dread. She had trusted Yuri, had followed him across an ocean to this wild land, but the skepticism of the valley was a heavy weight. She saw the way their neighbors looked at them, the pitying smiles, the hushed conversations that died when she approached. She looked at the massive mound of earth and wondered if they had indeed built their own tomb. If the clay trapped the moisture, if the logs rotted, they would have nothing. They would be homeless, in a land where homelessness was a death sentence. "Yuri," she whispered one night as they lay in the dark, the wind howling against the outer shell. "Are you sure? The neighbors, they say the wood will rot. Silas Vance is a good builder. What if he is right?" Yuri turned to her, his rough hand finding hers in the dark. He could feel her trembling, not just from the cold, but from the fear. "The wood will not rot, Nadia," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the dark. "The clay holds the logs like a mother holds a child. It keeps the cold wind away, and it keeps the dry warmth in. You must trust the earth. It has kept our people warm for 1,000 years." The first hard freeze came on November 12th. The ground turned to iron overnight, and the water in the creek froze solid from bank to bank. The wind came screaming down the valley, a relentless, ice-toothed beast that battered against the homesteads. But inside the Volkov cabin, something had changed. The drafts that had plagued them the previous winter were gone. The air was still and quiet. The massive internal stove, the pech, had been cured slowly with small, gentle fires throughout October. Now, Yuri loaded it with a moderate charge of split pine. The fire burned hot and clean, the serpentine flues capturing the heat before it could escape the chimney. The heavy stone and clay mass of the stove began to absorb the energy, warming slowly throughout the day. By evening, the stove was warm to the touch, not hot but radiating a gentle, even heat that filled the room. The heat did not escape through the walls. The logs, now insulated on the outside by 3 feet of packed clay, held the warmth. The clay berm itself had begun to absorb the escape heat from the logs, creating a stable thermal buffer. The temperature inside held at a comfortable 62 degrees F, even when the fire died down to coals. Nadia's hands stopped trembling. Oksana slept through the night, her breathing quiet and easy, the dry, rattling cough forgotten. Yuri stood in the center of the warm room, his body finally relaxed, his mind at peace. He looked at his wife, at his sleeping children, and then at the warm clay wall of the stove. The system was working. The heat battery was charging. They were ready for whatever the winter would bring. The true winter arrived in the last week of December, 1881, not as a gradual decline, but as a violent, unmitigated assault. The barometer in the regional land office began a precipitous, terrifying drop on the morning of December 24th. By afternoon, the high Colorado sky had taken on a peculiar, leaden-green cast, a hue that experienced plainsmen recognized as a herald of disaster. The wind, which had been gusting fitfully from the west, suddenly went dead calm, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence hanging over the valley. "It is the jaw of Canada," Yuri told his family, as he brought in the last of his kindling from the storage corridor. "When the wind goes quiet like this, it is only drawing its breath. The storm will be here before the dark." He was right. The wind arrived with the sunset, a sudden explosive roar out of the northwest that hit the cabin with the force of a physical blow. It was not a storm of snowflakes falling gently from the clouds. It was a whiteout of ground ice scoured from the high peaks, driven by sustained winds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts that rumbled like artillery. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. By midnight, the thermometer outside the Stevensville trading post read 31 below zero. By the morning of December 26th, it had plummeted to an unbelievable 42 below zero. It was a cold that transcended mere discomfort. It was a lethal, crystalline presence that redefined the physical world. Exposed skin froze and blackened in under 2 minutes. The moisture in a man's lungs would crystallize with each breath, producing a sharp, burning pain that made deep inhalation impossible. The oil in lanterns turned to thick, white lard, and the resin inside green timber froze and expanded, making the pine logs in standard cabins pop and crack with sounds like pistol shots. The wind was the true weapon. At 50 miles per hour, the wind chill factor dropped the effective temperature to nearly 70 below zero. This velocity created a relentless pressure on every building, scouring the heat from outer surfaces through rapid convective cooling. It searched out every microscopic gap in every wall, prying loose shingles, forcing fine, icy dust through the tightest door frames, and turning every standard log cabin into a cold box. Across the valley, families were in immediate, desperate trouble. The cold was a heavy hand that seemed to squeeze the life out of the land. At the Thorne household, Jedediah woke to find his kitchen floor coated in a sheet of ice, the water bucket frozen solid to its wooden bench. His fire, fed with pine that had been seasoned but stored under a damp tarp, hissed and sputtered, producing a thick, acrid smoke that filled the small cabin. He cracked a window to clear the air, but the Arctic air rushed in like a flood, instantly dropping the room's temperature to near freezing. Yuri's cabin, however, stood silent and stable in the teeth of the gale. The sloped, rounded shape of the clay berm deflected the wind, forcing the Arctic gusts to slide over the structure rather than battering against the flat log walls. There was no pressure on the cabin's joints, no draft snaking along the floor, no frost forming on the interior wood. The wind, finding no purchase, passed over the mound of earth and vanished into the whiteout. Inside, the air was still and warm. The heavy stone and clay mass of the internal stove, the peck, was fully charged, holding the energy of the moderate fires Yuri built twice a day. The temperature held steady at 66 degrees. The heat did not escape. It was buffered by the 3-foot-thick layer of clay that insulated the cabin from the frozen outside world. Nadia went about her chores in a simple wool dress. Her movements relaxed, her face free of the tight, pinched look that Nadia saw on the other women in the valley. She baked flatbread on the warm clay platform of the stove, the smell of rising yeast filling the room, a warm, comforting reminder of life in a world that seemed to be freezing to death. Petro and Oksana played with wooden toys on a blanket near the stove, their laughter a quiet counterpoint to the howling wind outside. Yuri watched them, his mind reflecting on the difference between this winter and the last. He remembered the shivering nights, the frost on his daughter's bedding, the constant, desperate fear of running out of fuel. He looked at the warm clay walls of his stove, then at the thick logs of his cabin, protected from the wind by his hill of earth. He had built more than a shelter. He had built a sanctuary. The old-world wisdom, the peasant knowledge of Poltava, had stood the test of the deadliest winter the valley had ever seen. By the 5th day of the cold snap, the Arkansas River Valley was in a state of quiet desperation. The roads were completely gone, buried under drifts of packed snow that were 5 feet deep, and the phone lines, which had only recently been extended to the larger ranches, were down across the county. Every household was on its own, isolated in a frozen white wilderness. The battle for survival was fought not with weapons, but with the splitting maul and the fireplace. At the Vance household, the situation was turning critical. Silas Vance, for all his carpentry skill, was discovering the limits of timber. His beautiful cabin, which had been the pride of the valley, had turned into a cold box. The straight, clean pine logs conducted the heat from his stove straight to the outside, the wood offering almost no resistance to the extreme cold. The interior walls were coated in a half-inch of rime frost, the delicate white crystals growing larger every night as the moisture from the family's breath froze on the cold wood. Vance's wife, Sarah, had hung every quilt and blanket they owned over the windows and the door, but the cold still seeped in, a heavy, invisible presence that settled on the floor. Their youngest son's cough had returned, a dry, hacking rattle that seemed to echo in the cold room. Vance spent his days hauling wood from his outdoor pile, his face frostbitten, his hands split and bleeding. He was burning through his seasoned pine at a rate of half a cord every 3 days, his fuel supply shrinking before his eyes. He had tried to use some green wood he had cut in September, but the high moisture content made it burn poorly, producing a thick, yellow smoke that filled the cabin but gave almost no heat. The cast iron stove was running full blast, its metal glowing a dull red, but the heat vanished the moment it moved more than 5 feet from the firebox. Vance's family lived in a tight, shivering circle around the stove, their coats on, their boots laced tight, their faces pale with exhaustion. Jedediah Thorne's family downriver was in even worse shape. Thorne had run out of seasoned wood on the third day of the storm, having underestimated the wood consumption required for such extreme cold. He was now burning his emergency reserves fence posts, split pine rails, and even a heavy oak bench he had built for the porch. The heat from these makeshift fuels was inconsistent and short-lived, forcing him to wake every hour to feed the fire. His cabin was a dark, smoke-filled cave, the air thick with the smell of burning pine pitch and damp earth. His water barrel had frozen solid, and he was forced to melt snow in a copper kettle, a slow, energy-consuming task that further depleted his fuel. His children were weak from the cold and the smoke, their eyes red and watery, their spirits broken by the relentless misery of the freeze. Thorne stood by his stove, his hand shaking, and looked at his remaining woodpile. He had perhaps 2 days of fence rails left. The contrast between these homes and the Volkov cabin was stark. While his neighbors were burning through their reserves in a desperate attempt to stay warm, Yuri's wood consumption remained incredibly low. His dry, seasoned pine, stored in the protected corridor between the cabin and the clay berm, was burning at peak efficiency. Because the wood was dry, it released nearly 7,000 BTUs per pound, nearly double the heat output of the damp, icy logs his neighbors were struggling to burn. Yuri's internal stove, the PEC, acted as a thermal flywheel, storing the energy of his moderate fires and releasing it slowly over 24 hours. He loaded the stove only twice a day, using a fraction of the wood Thorne and Vance were burning. The temperature inside held at a steady 66 degrees. The air was dry and clean, the drafts non-existent. Nadia's sourdough starter, which would have been a frozen, dead lump in any other cabin, lived and bubbled in its earthenware bowl on the kitchen counter. She used it to bake fresh, warm bread every morning, the smell filling the cabin with a sense of comfort and safety. Petro and Oksana played quietly by the stove, their bodies warm, their lungs clear of the coughs that plagued the other children in the settlement. The neighbors, however, knew nothing of this. In their isolation, they assumed the Volkovs were suffering like everyone else, perhaps even worse. Silas Vance, sitting by his glowing stove, his hands wrapped in blankets, felt a pang of guilt. He had warned Yuri, had called his design a mud coffin, but now he wondered if his own house was the real trap. His timber, his craftsmanship, his pride, none of it was keeping his family warm. The cold was a relentless, unyielding force, and his beautiful log cabin was failing. To understand the true genius of Yuri Volkov's design, one had to look beyond the simple warmth of his cabin and analyze the physics of the thermal battery he had constructed. The 80,000 pounds of packed clay and sand that enveloped his home, the mud hill that had been the butt of every joke in the valley, had become a highly sophisticated environmental control system, operating on principles that defied the conventional wisdom of the frontier. First, there was the principle of thermal lag. Clay, with its high density and moderate specific heat capacity, absorbs heat slowly and releases it even slower. The heat generated by Yuri's internal stove and by the family's own bodies did not escape through the logs to the outside air. Instead, it was slowly absorbed by the inner layers of the clay berm. It took nearly 36 hours for a change in interior temperature to migrate through the thick earthen walls. This meant that the extreme diurnal temperature swings of the high plains, the bitter drop from a 0-degree afternoon to a 30 below zero night, were completely smoothed out by the time they reached the plains, cabin's interior. The walls acted as a massive buffer, dampening the cold and holding a stable temperature. While his neighbors' cabins experienced temperature fluctuations of 30 degrees or more over a single day, the Volkov cabin varied by less than 4 degrees. Second, there was the elimination of convective heat loss. In a standard cabin, the wind scours the log walls, rapidly stripping away the thin boundary layer of warm air that clings to the wood. This convective cooling is what makes wind chill so deadly to buildings as well as people. But Yuri's clay berm was sloped, creating an aerodynamic rampart that forced the Arctic winds to slide over the cabin rather than battering against the flat walls. The wind, finding no purchase, passed over the rounded mound of earth and vanished into the whiteout, leaving the air inside the corridor dead and still. Still, air is an exceptional insulator, with an R value of nearly 3 per inch when trapped in small spaces. The air gap between the logs and the clay, packed with straw, acted as a series of dead air pockets, cutting heat loss by 90%. Third, there was the passive moisture management. In a conventional log cabin, the moisture from breathing and cooking migrates toward the cold walls and freezes, creating frost. This frost then acts as a cold sink, drawing even more warmth away. But Yuri had packed dry straw between the logs and the clay, creating a breathable path. The clay itself, being a natural material, absorbed the excess humidity from inside and slowly released it to the dry outside air through the ventilation ports. The logs remained completely dry, preventing the frost accumulation and subsequent rot that Silas Vance had predicted. The results of this system were evident in the simple, quiet life of the Volkov household. On the 8th day of the freeze, with the outside temperature holding at 38 below zero, the interior of the cabin sat at a comfortable 65 degrees. Nadia sat on the warm clay platform of the peck, her hands busy with a spindle, her face relaxed. The room was warm enough that she had discarded her heavy shawl, working in her light linen work clothes. On the table sat the bowl of sourdough starter, its surface active with slow, bubbling life. Alona used it to bake fresh, warm bread every morning, the rich, yeasty scent filling the cabin with a sense of peace that seemed out of place in a world locked in a deadly freeze. In the corner, her pot of chives continued to grow, its green shoots reaching toward the pale winter light that filtered through the deep window well. Petro and Oksana played quietly on a blanket near the stove, their bodies warm, their lungs clear of the dry, hacking coughs that plagued the other children in the settlement. They were not huddled near the fire, in a tight circle of survival. Their world was large and safe, extending to every corner of the warm cabin. They played with simple wooden toys Yuri had carved, their laughter a quiet, joyful sound that defied the howling wind outside. Yuri sat at the table, his rough hands cradling a cup of hot tea, and watched his children. He had spent his life working with clay, understanding its weight and its power, but he had never seen it perform with such quiet, life-saving efficiency. He had taken the worthless mud of the valley and turned it into a fortress of warmth, a heat battery that held through the longest, coldest night. He knew that his neighbors were suffering, that their timber and their pride were failing them, but he also knew that he had done what was necessary to keep his family alive. The old-world wisdom, the peasant knowledge of Poltava, had stood the test of the deadliest winter the valley had ever seen. On the morning of January 5th, the 9th day of the relentless freeze, Silas Vance awoke to a new disaster. His prized draft horse, a massive gray gelding named Jude, had broken through the frozen latch of the lean-to during the night, driven by panic from the howling wind, and wandered off into the whiteout. The gelding was Vance's livelihood, the powerful engine he used to haul heavy logs for his framing business. He could not afford to lose the animal, nor could he bear the thought of the creature freezing to death in the open valley. Pulling on his heaviest wool coat, his boots lined with scraps of sheepskin, and his face wrapped in a heavy scarf, Vance stepped out into the killing cold. The wind was running at 35 miles per hour, pushing the wind chill to 50 below zero. The air was a wall of blinding white, the snow scoured from the prairie and driven in horizontal sheets that stung his eyes and made breathing a painful, shallow struggle. He followed the faint, drifting tracks of the horse, his heavy boots sinking to the knee with each step. The landscape was alien, transformed by the extreme cold into a glittering, white desert. Every tree branch, every fence post, every blade of bunchgrass was coated in a thick, crystalline layer of hoarfrost that sparkled like diamonds in the pale winter sun. His own cabin, when he looked back, was a shimmering dome of ice, its log walls glazed white where the warm moisture from inside had escaped and frozen on the exterior wood. The house looked beautiful, but Vance knew it was the beauty of a glacier. It was a cold box, its wood bleeding heat into the sky like water from a sieve. He passed the Pritchard place, which was also encased in a glittering shell of frost, a desperate, thick column of smoke pouring from its chimney as Jedediah Thorne burned through his remaining fence rails. The horse's tracks led Vance up the long slope toward the Volkov property. His fingers were losing sensation, a dull, heavy ache settling in his hands and feet. The cold was a heavy hand that seemed to squeeze his chest, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He knew he was in serious trouble. Hypothermia was setting in, his mind growing slow and clouded, his legs heavy as lead. He needed shelter, and he needed it now. As he crested the rise, he stopped, his eyes struggling to focus through the blinding glare of the snow. Below him lay the Volkov homestead, but it looked wrong. In a world that was universally white, glittering and sheathed in ice, the low, rounded mound of the Volkov cabin was a patch of dark, matte gold-brown. There was no shimmering coat of frost on its earthen walls. The snow that had fallen during the storm had not accumulated on the windward side. The aerodynamic curve of the clay berm had forced the drafts to slide over and around, leaving the surface clear and dry. A thin, lazy curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of a slow, efficient fire, not the desperate, raging blaze of his own hearth. Vance stumbled down the slope, his boots slipping on the hard-packed drifts. He walked right up to the north wall of the cabin, the wall that had taken the brunt of the Arctic wind for 9 days. He expected to see frozen, rock-hard mud, a surface as cold and unyielding as solid ice. He pulled off his thick wool mitten, his bare hand instantly stinging in the frigid air. He hesitated for a second, then pressed his palm flat against the clay berm. He was braced for a shock of biting cold, the kind of pain that steals your breath and numbs the skin instantly. But it didn't come. What he felt was so unexpected, it took his clouded mind a moment to process. It was not warm, but it was a profound, deep, resonant lack of cold. The earth felt stable, neutral. It was not part of the frozen, screaming wilderness around him. It was part of the house. He could feel, or imagined he could feel, a deep, latent energy held within the clay, a thermal momentum that held through the longest, coldest night. All the heat that his own house was bleeding into the sky was stored right here, in this massive, brilliant wall of mud. He stood there, his hand pressed against the clay, the wind howling around him, and he finally understood. Yuri Volkov was not a madman. He was a master of heat. Silas Vance's legs finally gave out, his body collapsing against the earthen wall of the cabin, his consciousness slipping into a gray, frozen haze. But before he could sink into the deep sleep of hypothermia, the heavy wooden door of the cabin swung open. Yuri Volkov stood in the doorway, his face framed by the warm glow of the interior light. Seeing the carpenter slumped against his wall, Yuri didn't hesitate. He grabbed Vance by the shoulders and pulled him inside, closing the heavy, double-insulated door against the screaming wind. A wave of genuine, deep warmth rolled over Vance's freezing body. It was not the dry, scorching heat of a red-hot stove, but a soft, enveloping warmth that seemed to fill the very air of the room. Yuri and Nadia quickly pulled off his frozen boots, wrapped his numbed feet in warm wool cloths, and sat him on a bench near the massive clay stove, the pech. As the circulation returned to his hands and feet, bringing a sharp, stinging pain that made his eyes water, Vance looked around the room. The cabin was warm, actually, genuinely warm. Nadia was working at the table in a simple linen dress, her face relaxed and free of the tight, pinched look that Nadia had worn for days. On the table sat the bowl of sourdough starter, active and bubbling. The pot of chives on the windowsill was green and healthy, untouched by the frost that had killed every houseplant in the valley. Petro and Oksana played quietly on a blanket near the stove, their bodies warm, their lungs clear of the dry coughs that plagued his own children. They were not huddled in a tight, shivering circle of survival. Their world was safe and comfortable, extending to every corner of the warm cabin. Vance looked at the massive, rounded form of the clay stove. It sat in the center of the room, a quiet giant radiating a steady, even heat. He reached out and pressed his bare palm against the clay surface of the stove. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but holding a deep, resonant heat that seemed to vibrate through his hand. "It holds the heat, Silas," Yuri said quietly, offering him a cup of hot herbal tea. Holds it and gives it back slowly, all night, all day. Vance took the cup, his hands trembling, not just from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization of his own failure. He thought of his own shivering children, of his dwindling woodpile, of his professional pride, and the arrogance that had made him call Yuri's design a mud coffin. He looked at the warm, stable room, at the dry logs, at the healthy children, and he felt a wave of humility so profound it almost brought him to his knees. His straight lines, his saddle notches, his engineered timber, none of it had been enough to save his family from the killing cold. He had mistaken familiarity for expertise, assuming that because he knew how to build a log cabin, he knew how to build the best cabin. But Yuri had looked beyond the wood. He had understood the laws of heat, the power of mass, and the wisdom of the earth. "I was wrong, Yuri," Vance whispered, his voice cracked with emotion, his eyes meeting the Hungarian's steady gaze. "I called this place a grave, but it's the only real home in this entire valley. You saved my life, and you've shown me how to save my family. Please, teach me." Yuri smiled, a gentle, quiet expression that held no trace of triumph or gloating. He placed a hand on the carpenter's shoulder. "The earth has no pride, Silas," Yuri said softly. "It serves us all when we listen to it. I will teach you. We will build together." The cold snap finally broke on January 16th, the sky clearing to a brilliant, blinding blue as the temperatures climbed back to a relatively mild 10 degrees above zero. But the valley was a different place. The stories of suffering were on everyone's lips at the Stevensville trading post. Families had burned through their entire winter reserves of wood, livestock had been lost in frozen barns, and the Pritchards had been forced to burn their porch rails to stay warm. Amidst these tales of hardship, the story of the Farkas cabin, now properly called the Volkov cabin, began to spread, no longer told with ridicule, but with a tone of quiet awe. Silas Vance was the first to speak out. He stood before the gathering of ranchers and builders at the trading post, his face still showing the marks of minor frostbite, and told them how Yuri Volkov's mud hill had saved his life during the worst of the storm. "I built half the cabins in this valley," Vance told the silent crowd, his voice carrying the heavy weight of his conversion, "and I told Yuri he was building a grave. But I stood in his cabin while the outside was 38 below, and it was 68 degrees inside. His family wasn't shivering. His children weren't coughing. He didn't build a coffin, gentlemen. He built a hearth around his house." Thomas Calloway, who hauled coal and wood along the Arkansas River, provided the final, irrefutable proof. He pulled his heavy leather ledger from his pocket and laid it on the counter, turning to the page where he tracked the fuel deliveries for each household in the settlement. "Numbers don't lie," Calloway said, pointing to the columns. The Vance place burned through 2.5 cords of wood in January. The Thorne place used nearly 3, plus half a ton of coal. The average cabin in this valley went through 2 full cords. Yuri Volkov used less than half a cord of wood and a quarter ton of coal the entire month. He saved nearly 70% of his fuel, and his cabin was 20 degrees warmer than any of yours. The silence in the trading post was profound. In a world where wood was scarce and labor was hard, those numbers spoke louder than any argument. The ranchers looked at each other, their skepticism melting away in the face of the simple, brutal economics of survival. The Hungarian peasant, the oven builder they had mocked, had outperformed every seasoned builder in the territory. He had done it with worthless clay and common straw, using the very earth they walked on to defeat the deadliest winter in a generation. The laughing stopped, and the learning began. When spring finally arrived, turning the deep snowdrifts into rushing torrents that fed the Arkansas River, the earth did not rot the Volkov cabin. Instead, the clay straw mixture dried to a hard, durable plaster, its outer skin shedding the spring rains, just as it had deflected the winter winds. The logs inside remained dry and solid, preserved by the breathable clay shell. And Yuri's homestead was no longer isolated. It had become the center of a quiet, revolutionary change in the valley. Caleb Dorsey's equivalent, Silas Vance, was the first to dig his clay pit. Together with Yuri, he bermed his own cabin that summer, refining the technique to fit his timber framing. By autumn, 3 more families had adopted the method. The mud hill had become a symbol of wisdom, a sign of a rancher who understood his environment and refused to fight nature with brute force. For Yuri and Nadia, the true victory was not the valley's sudden respect, but the quiet safety of their children. As the seasons rolled on, Oksana's lungs grew strong, her dry cough a distant memory. Petro ran through the green bunchgrass of summer, his laughter no longer shadowed by the fear of the coming freeze. Nadia stood in her warm, clean kitchen, her sourdough starter bubbling on the counter, and looked at her husband with a deep, silent gratitude. They had found their sanctuary. The deadly winter of 1881 did not break the settlers of the Arkansas River Valley. Instead, it broke their pride. Under the guidance of Yuri Volkov, the very men who had laughed at his mud hill spent the following spring digging clay, mixing straw, and banking their timber walls. For the first time, the valley built with the earth, rather than against it. For Yuri and Nadia, the true victory lay not in the valley's sudden respect, but in the quiet safety of their own home. As the seasons rolled on, little Oksana's lungs grew strong, and the family no longer lived from fire to fire, but in a deep, enduring warmth that held through every mountain storm. They had transformed their survival into a legacy. Today, those earth-banked cabins stand as early ancestors of modern sustainable design, a reminder that progress is not always about building stronger heaters, but about building smarter homes. Sometimes, the ancient ways of the earth hold the very key to our survival. If this story of traditional wisdom and resilience inspired you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue to uncover these forgotten lessons of the past.